have and what you guys need to do to be as good as you want going forward?
Yeah, I think first and foremost,
There is a war happening inside the WNBA. Most people don't know when it started or who started it. It didn't begin with a flagrant foul or a viral clip. It began in a coaching office with a whiteboard, a game plan, and a decision that would move through an entire professional league like a slow current nobody felt until it was pulling everyone under. One coach made one call, and suddenly the most widely covered basketball player in women's sports had a target on her back that every team in the league could see. The person who made that call never said a word in public. Stephanie White, head coach of the Connecticut Sun, never convened a press conference to announce her approach to Caitlin Clark. She gave no interviews laying out the strategy in plain language. What she did instead was build a philosophy and drill it into her players until it became reflex. The philosophy was direct. There would be no grace period for Clark, no acknowledgement of her college legacy or the viewership records she'd rewritten. From the moment Clark stepped onto the court against Connecticut, she would be treated as any established opponent, met with sustained physicality, suffocating defensive pressure, and no allowance for the kind of rhythm she had built over 4 years at Iowa. The strategy was not punitive, it was deliberate, and every other coaching staff in the league was watching to see whether it would hold. It did. To understand why White was the one to establish this, her background is relevant. She played at Purdue in a program built around defense and toughness before a professional career in the WNBA. Her coaching philosophy has never been ornamental. The Connecticut Sun under her direction became known throughout the league for defensive commitment, relentless physicality, and a style of play that prioritizes wearing opponents down over the course of a full game. That wasn't an identity White built for this situation. It was already there. She simply directed it. Her roster was suited to the task. Players like Alyssa Thomas and Dejounte Carrington brought experience and competitive edge to the assignment. White didn't need to construct a new defense to neutralize Clark. She needed to aim what her team already was at a specific target. The approach was efficient precisely because it didn't require reinvention. When Connecticut and Indiana met for the first time last season, the gap between what fans expected and what actually happened was significant. Clark was face-guarded across the full length of the court from the opening possession. She was challenged physically on every cut, every catch attempt, every shot. Carrington in particular remained a constant presence, denying Clark space before she could establish any working rhythm. The strategy was to make every possession expensive, disrupt the timing, force low-percentage decisions, and accumulate physical toll across 40 minutes. The box score reflected some of this: elevated turnovers, shooting percentages below Clark's established norms. But the statistics alone don't capture what the game demonstrated. What became visible over the course of that contest was something more significant than a single result: a proof of concept. Clark, operating at the professional level for the first time, could be disrupted by sustained elite defensive attention. That information left the arena and circulated. The physicality directed at Clark increased across the league in the weeks that followed. Game by game, regardless of the opposing team, Clark encountered similar levels of defensive aggression, contact, and pressure more typically associated with established veterans than with first-year players. The incident involving Chicago Sky's Kennedy Carter, a hip check directed at Clark away from the ball, drew widespread public attention and considerable criticism. For many observers, the moment functioned as evidence of a coordinated pattern rather than an isolated act. White had not communicated a playbook to other teams. She didn't need to. The Connecticut game had served as the instruction. Teams drew their own conclusions from the tape. The broader context around Clark's first season added pressure that extended well beyond the physical. She had entered the league carrying expectations that no WNBA rookie had faced before. Media coverage framed her arrival in terms that were almost without precedent in women's sports, as a transformative figure whose presence would reshape the league's economics and visibility. Every statistic she produced was measured against that framing. Every difficult game was dissected publicly. When Clark was left off the Team USA Olympic roster, the reaction outside the league was intense. For many observers, the decision felt like a formal statement from within the sports establishment, that visibility and popularity were not sufficient credentials, that there remained a threshold she had not yet crossed in the eyes of those who had built the league. Whether or not that reading was accurate, the effect was to sharpen an existing narrative, that Clark was navigating not only on-court competition, but a set of institutional dynamics that operated beyond any single game. Underneath the basketball, there is a tension within the league that rarely gets stated plainly. The players who competed in the WNBA before Clark's arrival did so under conditions that were often difficult: limited broadcast coverage, modest salaries, commercial travel, minimal mainstream recognition. Over years and decades, they sustained the league through those conditions. Then, within months of Clark's arrival, several of those conditions changed. Charter flights became standard. national broadcast visibility increased. Public engagement with the league expanded at a pace that had no prior parallel. The benefits were real and distributed across the roster, but the association with one player's arrival was not lost on those who had been present for the years that preceded it. None of this was stated openly. The professional environment doesn't accommodate that kind of candor, but the intensity of what Clark faced on the court, the personal quality that sometimes accompanied hard fouls and contested plays, suggested to a number of observers that something beyond game planning was present. The outcome of all this has not been what the strategy appeared designed to produce. Rather than diminishing Clark's profile, the sustained targeting gave her a more durable narrative than any promotional campaign could have manufactured. Fans who came to the league because of her found an additional reason to stay. They were watching someone absorb consistent adversity and continue to compete. The underdog framing, never explicitly constructed, simply emerging from circumstances, attached a degree of emotional investment to Clark's games that went beyond skill appreciation. Viewership remained elevated. Public engagement with the league continued at levels it had not previously reached. The physicality directed at Clark, intended to establish that she was not exceptional, had the effect of making her story more compelling. There is also a developmental dimension to what Clark experienced. The level of defensive attention she faced in her first season, extreme by any measure for a rookie, compressed what would normally be a multi-year acclimation into a single season. She learned to read professional defenses under conditions that offered no adjustment period. She learned to distribute under pressure, to operate in contact, to find teammates when her own space was fully denied. The process was not smooth. There were games where the difficulties were obvious, but the adaptation was real. She enters her second season with experience that most players accumulate over several years. The position the league now occupies is more complex than it was before Clark's arrival. The strategy that was meant to assert continuity, to communicate that the existing order would not simply yield to a new arrival's reputation, produced an outcome that complicated that message. Clark's fan base deepened. Her story gained texture. The league gained visibility it had not previously commanded. And the players whose sustained effort built the foundation that Clark walked into are by extension part of a larger platform than they had before. Where this trajectory leads is not settled. Clark's second season will test whether the adaptation she underwent in her first produces the performance step that her profile anticipates. The league's approach to her will likely evolve. The original blueprint has now been studied by everyone, including the person it was designed to stop. Whether a more refined version emerges or whether the dynamic shifts as Clark's own capabilities develop is the open question that the next season will begin to answer. What Stephanie White set in motion was a real and consequential strategic decision. Its effects moved through the league in ways she may not have fully anticipated. The plan was designed to establish limits. The result was a player who has now been tested against those limits in public over the course of a full season, with a significant portion of the sports-watching public paying attention to the outcome. The league wanted to know whether Clark would hold up under sustained professional pressure. The answer, through one season, is that she did. What that means for the seasons ahead is the question that remains. The deeper question now isn't whether Caitlin Clark can survive what the league threw at her. That question has been answered. The more pressing question, the one that front offices, coaches, and veteran players are quietly working through, is what comes next, and who bears the cost of getting it wrong. White's blueprint was effective in a narrow sense. It disrupted Clark's rhythm in individual games. It established a physical standard that other teams adopted. It communicated clearly that the WNBA's established players would not simply step aside because a rookie arrived with extraordinary public momentum. All of that is true, but strategies have second and third order effects, and the second order effects here have not been favorable to the teams that executed the plan most aggressively. Consider what the physicality actually produced at the roster level. The Sun, the Sky, and other teams that leaned hardest into the aggressive approach spent significant defensive energy and accumulated foul trouble in the process. Games against Indiana became events with elevated stakes and elevated attention, which meant that every excessive foul, every controversial non-call, every moment of visible aggression directed at Clark was broadcast to the largest audiences the league had seen in years. Teams that might have preferred to operate without that level of scrutiny found themselves in a spotlight they hadn't bargained for. The strategy raised the cost of every mistake made against Clark, because the audience watching those mistakes was larger than anything women's professional basketball had previously generated. There is also a recruitment dimension that has received almost no public discussion. The WNBA's ability to attract the next generation of elite players depends partly on perception, on whether the league is seen as a place where excellence is rewarded and where the best players in the world want to compete. Clark's arrival accelerated the league's visibility in ways that benefit future recruitment, both of players and of the corporate partners that fund salaries and operations. If the handling of her rookie season is remembered primarily for its aggression and institutional resistance, that perception carries forward. Prospective players, college programs, and sponsors all form views of a league based on how it treats its most prominent figures. The league has a long-term interest in that perception being positive, and the events of last season complicated that interest in ways that will take time to fully assess. The officiating question is separate but connected. Throughout Clark's rookie season, the consistency of foul calls made against players guarding her, or more precisely, the inconsistency, generated sustained criticism from fans, analysts, and former players. The league's officiating has been a subject of debate for years, but Clark's presence brought that debate to a much wider audience. When plays that appeared to meet the standard for flagrant contact went unaddressed, the reaction was no longer limited to the core fan base. It reached casual viewers, sports media platforms, and commentators who had not previously followed the league closely. The WNBA found itself defending its officiating standards to an audience it had spent years trying to attract. That is not a position any professional league manages easily, and it is a direct consequence of the strategic approach that White's blueprint normalized. Indiana's front office has been watching all of this and adjusting. The Fever entered last season without the depth or experience to absorb what Connecticut and others brought. They were in several respects undersized for the moment, a young roster built around a transformative player, but not yet equipped to protect her or to compensate when she was neutralized. That imbalance was visible throughout the season. Clark was often left to manage defensive schemes with limited supporting infrastructure, which amplified both the difficulty of her situation and the statistical consequences of the attention directed at her. The organizational response to that will shape the next phase of this story. If Indiana adds the experience, the physicality, and the secondary playmaking to reduce Clark's isolation on the court, the blueprint that White established becomes significantly less effective. Clark's own adaptation, her improved decision-making under pressure, her faster reads of professional defensive coverage, combined with a more capable supporting cast, would present a different problem for opposing coaching staffs. The challenge shifts from containing one player to covering a functional team. That is a much harder assignment. From White's perspective, the situation is also evolving. She built a strategy suited to a specific version of Clark, a rookie navigating professional basketball for the first time, with an incomplete team around her, and no experience of sustained elite defensive attention. That version no longer exists. The Clark who enters the next season has been through 40 regular season games of exactly what White designed. She has data on what the pressure feels like, where her own game broke down, and what adjustments reduced the effectiveness of the coverage. White is an intelligent coach. She understands that a blueprint used once at full visibility loses a significant portion of its effect when the subject has had a full offseason to study it. She will adapt. The question is whether her adaptation stays ahead of Clark's. The league itself is at a decision point that extends beyond any single player or coaching staff. The WNBA is, for the first time in its history, generating consistent mainstream sports media attention, not tied to a specific event or controversy. That attention is an asset. It funds expansion. It drives broadcast negotiations. It creates leverage with sponsors that the league has never previously had at this scale. The way that asset is managed over the next several seasons will determine whether the current moment represents a genuine structural shift in the league's position within American sports culture, or a temporary elevation that recedes when the novelty of Clark's arrival fades. That management requires the league to navigate a genuine tension. The veterans who built the WNBA have a legitimate claim on recognition and on the improved conditions that increased revenue makes possible. The new audience that arrived with Clark has expectations about the product they're watching and the player they followed into the league. Those two constituencies do not always want the same things, and satisfying both requires a level of institutional coordination that professional sports leagues do not always execute cleanly. What the next season will reveal, in practical terms, is whether the WNBA has the infrastructure to capitalize on what the last season created. Not just the broadcast agreements and the charter flights and the expanded rosters, but the institutional culture, the officiating standards, the player development systems, and the competitive balance that makes a league worth watching beyond the presence of any single player. Clark drew the audience. The league has to give that audience a reason to stay. Stephanie White's announcement, such as it was, set all of this in motion. A coaching decision made without a press conference, communicated through game film rather than public statement, produced consequences that are still unfolding. The strategy worked within its original parameters. Its effects beyond those parameters were not part of the design. That gap between what the plan was meant to accomplish and what it actually produced is where the most significant parts of this story are still being written.